Okay, as one of the unmuted elite, I will certainly do that. And good to, well, not see everyone, but know everyone is here. I will probably get rid of my little video picture after a few minutes. Last week, I found that I was glancing over to see what I looked like and that I wasn't doing anything too embarrassing. So I'll probably just get rid of my self-image, at least for a time. I'll ask Laurie to solicit questions, or I'll solicit questions. I guess I can do that directly a couple of times during the class, as well as 5 minutes or so from the end. Okay, so let's pick up with where we left off yesterday, last week rather, which was a fairly, not just fairly, which was a pretty dismal place to be. We were talking about the arrival of diseases in the Western Hemisphere, pointing out that the arrival of the Europeans, beginning with Columbus, the Spanish, and then other Europeans, brought an array of new diseases to the Western Hemisphere, and I'd emphasized that before the arrival of the Europeans, the Western Hemisphere was a huge disease island, a useful term, a huge disease island blocked for the most part by the cold screen in the Arctic from the migration of diseases coming down. The only Europeans to arrive in the Western Hemisphere before Columbus were the Norse, Scandinavians, who turned up most notably in Newfoundland, Labrador, and Greenland. But there weren't enough of them. They didn't stay long enough. And there's no evidence that they brought any diseases, any epidemics. But their successors, the Spanish and so on, certainly did. And it's worth emphasizing that when you get a new contagious disease, and of course this resonates sadly with our current world, when we get a new contagious disease, measles or smallpox or a virus, and it breaks into a population never before exposed to it, particularly if the population lacks social distancing and personal protective equipment, that new disease is going to hit first in the form of a lethal plague that may be fatal to 10%, 30%, 50%, or more of the people who get it. For example, this happened in the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, and in China too at about the same time. Smallpox and we think probably measles swept out of South Central Asia for the first time, where it had apparently developed as a mutation. What happened in the Roman and Chinese worlds in the years 100 to 300 CE was that for the first time in the history of the world, there was enough steady commercial and military contact between relatively densely populated portions of the world, the Roman world, the Near East, the Mideast, China, enough travel and enough urban populations for the germs to follow the trade and the troops. So by 1492, Europe, Asia, North Africa were all part of one big disease pool, a big disease pool sporting lots of endemic diseases. Sometimes the endemic diseases would roar out as an epidemic or a pandemic, but most of them, like smallpox, measles became endemic. That is, your chances of getting them as a young person were really pretty good, very good in some places. But the chances of surviving and developing a degree of immunity were also very good. And if you're looking for important rules of history, universal rules of history, one is that any society with lots of endemic contagious diseases has a big advantage over any people without them, barring modern medicine. In short, the well-diseased society has a potent biological weapon, even if they don't know they do. And this is a big deal. H.G. Wells, the pioneering science fiction writer, saw this more than a century ago when he wrote War of the Worlds, which many of us, I'm sure, have read and or seen one of the movies. Okay, so it's clear that this was working against the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. The fact that they were a disease island and they were being invaded by people with lots of contagious diseases. Also working against these indigenous people was the fact that they had few domesticated animals. In Eurasia and Africa, if you had a bad crop year, you could always eat the cow. Herds of animals, edible animals, acted as a cushion against famine. Whereas in the Western Hemisphere, the only large animals that people ate were the bison. They weren't everywhere and they were hard to catch. They were not domesticated. The only domesticated large animals were in South America, llamas, alpacas. Okay, so how many people are we talking about before the arrival of the Europeans? How many were living before the arrival of the Europeans? And to put it brutally, how many were corpses afterwards? Okay, in all of North and South America, the entire hemisphere, in 1492, there were up to 80 to 90 million people, possibly only 40 to 50 million. And demographers, historical demographers, go back and forth on this. But it's likely closer to the 80, 90 million figure. And if we accept the higher range, there were about 25 million people in each of the two great major polities, great political units of the Western Hemisphere, the Aztec world in Mesoamerica, central and southern Mexico, and the Inca world in the Andes. Elsewhere in the hemisphere, modest numbers, about 30,000 people, to take an example, in Puerto Rico, about 5 million people in what's now the United States, much smaller number north in what's now Canada and Alaska. Okay, we're going to be spending a little more time the next few minutes south of the border, as it were, in Latin America, because the arrival of the epidemics was so spectacular there, statistically and speaking in human terms. Okay, the Spanish arrived in the Aztec world in 1519, but their diseases had arrived before them, moving up from their arrival a few years earlier in Panama. But they turned up in the Aztec world in 1519, and here is one of the more sobering statistics you will ever hear, I think. By 1568, about 50 years later, 90% of the native population of Mexico was dead. By 1620, the low point of the population drop-off, there was a Mexican population, including Spaniards and mixed blood people, of only a bit above 1.5 million people. Now, I'm talking about the Aztec world, Mesoamerica, for two reasons. One is simply because the statistics are so awful, but also to emphasize that in one respect, the North American people had it better because the Aztecs had an extremely dense population. They had an urban world. They had the communication, the transportation, the population density that contagious diseases love. And there was no modern medical science. Well, tribe after tribe, area after area, culture after culture was dragged into the new Western Hemisphere disease pool. Sometimes for smaller tribes, the results were complete extinction, even as late as the 20th century, when efforts were usually made to avoid contagion. And as if Eurasian diseases weren't enough, illnesses from Africa brought in with slavery were also a problem. And slavery itself came in because Native Americans were no longer adequate for the labor force that the Spanish felt they needed. Luckily, the climate didn't allow all of the African diseases, primarily yellow fever and malaria, to settle in everywhere in the hemisphere. But where they could in the tropics and subtropics, there was a further catastrophe. Malaria arrived sometime after 1650 from Africans or Spaniards or Portuguese suffering from it. And a number of tribes in the Amazon and Orinoco River valleys in South America were driven into extinction. Okay, enough for the awful statistics. It's worth mentioning that, before we move on, I'm sure you've looked at the slide, not just smallpox and measles, but typhus, diphtheria, whooping cough, chickenpox, flu, influenza, typhoid, and trichinosis all came inadvertently from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere. There were a few diseases that came from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern. Syphilis, and historical epidemiologists have gone back and forth on this over recent decades, but I think the consensus now is that it was indeed a Western Hemisphere disease that appeared in Spain shortly after Columbus returned to Europe in 1493. And also a relatively minor dermatological disease, Chiga disease, caused by mites. So nothing comparable to the diseases that the Europeans brought. Before the Europeans arrived, there were some diseases in the Western Hemisphere already. Infections from wounds, cuts, and so on. These appear to have been universal around the world. Parasitic worms, probably a mild form of tuberculosis, of TB. Possibly, they're not sure, cancer, possibly arthritis. Arthritis, well, they're just not sure about. Arthritis seems to have been a new disease in the around the world. In Eurasia, its first clear description of arthritis was as recent as 1827. Okay, to the brighter side of the exchanges, food went back and forth. along with plagues. Um, the Europeans brought foods and brought back foods from America, from the Western Hemisphere to the rest of the world. And it's absolutely certain that the value of the nutritional boons sent to Eurasia and Africa from America was spectacular. Just running down the list, unessential but tasty foods like avocado, beans, cocoa. We wouldn't have chocolate without cacao, cashew nuts, chili, maize, corn, now universal. The Muscovy duck, I have no idea how the Muscovy duck got the name Muscovy duck when it came from the Western Hemisphere, but there you are. Papaya, peanuts, pecans, sweet potatoes, turkey, vanilla, and the white potato. And of course, among these, the potato around the world, particularly in places like Ireland, corn, Europe, Africa, cassava or manioc came from South America to Africa, a staple today in many parts of Africa, peanuts, tomatoes. And it's worth mentioning that the annual potato harvest in Europe since the Spanish conquest has been worth many times the value of all the gold and silver looted and mined by the Spaniards. Some food was also brought, significant foods brought from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere. Bananas, which we as Americans now like to associate with banana republics, I suppose, in Central America, came from Southeast Asia. Barley, cabbage, chicken, everyone's favorite coffee, cattle, very important, goats, onions, various fruits, pigs, rice, sheep, sugarcane, brought from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere, making the sugar islands of the West Indies profitable and slavery there very profitable. Turnips, wheat, horses and dogs. Not always eaten, but very useful as transportation and companionship. So the nutritional matrix of the entire Western Hemisphere was changed permanently by these new foods brought by what we call the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, things and people and diseases going back and forth between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. Tremendous nutritional boon to Europe, Asia, and Africa. Okay, so in summary, we can say that Europeans, Africans, Asians were better equipped biologically to survive in the Western Hemisphere than indigenous people, as they were more diseased. Likewise with plants. American flora was not really able in many cases to cope with the cattle, the sheep, the goats, the horses that the Europeans brought that grazed and grazed and grazed, grazed grasses that hadn't evolved to be grazed. This was a problem not just in the Western Hemisphere, but in Southeast and Southwest Pacific countries like Australia and New Zealand. So, as I think I mentioned last week, a number of Old World species tended to displace local species. Bluegrass, guinea grass, the great grazing grass of Central America and the West Indies. These tended to displace the local species. Okay, before we move to a local as opposed to a continental and hemispheric scene and look at a specific group of native North American people, the Pueblo people, let's open it up for a few minutes of questions before we move from bouncing back and forth all around the world to what's now the southwestern United States and the Pueblo people. So, questions. Unmute yourself and speak.
Ellen, this is Chris. And I have a question. When you were talking about a couple of diseases, you were talking about cancer and arthritis moving from one place to another. But those aren't really infectious diseases, I don't believe. So how would they have started in one place and moved to another?
Okay, which diseases were you mentioning there?
Cancer and arthritis.
Yeah, they were not infectious, and they, perhaps I shouldn't have included them in that listing. That's a good question, because they weren't infectious and they assaulted, if that's the term, both the Eastern and the Western Hemisphere at about the same time. If you're interested in the history of medicine, the KU Med Center has a history of medicine department, and from time to time, they hold public seminars, public meetings, talking about the history of, among other things, contagious and non-contagious diseases. But yeah, point taken, Chris. Those aren't contagious diseases, and perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned them.
Alan,
Yeah.
on the diseases, I was wondering about leprosy.
Okay, I'm not sure about leprosy. It is contagious. Chris, do you have any thoughts on that? On leprosy? Unmute yourself, Chris.
Yeah, I don't really know. So I would be guessing.
Yeah. Let me try to look that up. That's a good question. Leprosy. An awful disease, but a good question.
This is Judy. Can you hear me? Hello? Good. Because I'm not getting a full screen, but I'm working on it. I was fascinated with coffee because we take coffee for granted, but apparently, of course, the English drank tea and tea came to the United States. When did coffee get to be a thing, approximately?
I think, and this is more a guess than anything else, mid to late 19th century. I think it was sometime in that period that they began opening coffee plantations in places like Brazil. But the Americans and others were tea drinking people. Tea came over from China well before coffee became a big thing in the Western Hemisphere. Anybody have any more thoughts on coffee?
Coffee was very important in Europe in the late 1600s, which is really when it started hitting. As a person interested in music, I know that Bach, who composed in the late 1600s, wrote a coffee cantata celebrating coffee and the rise of coffee houses. And so it came well before that time. But I had a different question for you, Alan. With all the foods that are imported from the Western Hemisphere back to the East, it's an incredible variety of things. Does that mean that we had richer soil here, and therefore this vegetation promulgated in the Western Hemisphere and was then taken back east? Or I just wonder why there's so much more vegetable product in the West than in the East.
So many more vegetable products in the West of what again?
In the Western Hemisphere as opposed to the East.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I really have no idea why it was that corn developed. And okay, looking at the history of corn, one of the biggies, corn was a wild corn, and it was a wild grain. In the Mideast and in China, grains like barley and wheat turned out to be domesticable and growable, and they were the ones that were developed. The precursors by several thousand years to the Aztec in Mesoamerica, Middle America, found, and we have no idea who and how, but found that corn ears, which were very, very small initially, an inch or so, no larger, made good eating. And they began over a period of several thousand years to systematically cultivate and increase corn. And they have found corn only an inch or so large, remains of corn crops going back several thousand years. By the time the Europeans arrived, the corn plants being cultivated in Mesoamerica were not as large as the corn we have today, but getting right up there. So I think you can look to human ingenuity as much as anything else in the Western Hemisphere.
Might it be, I mean, this is just a guess, this is Chris, that it might be that because they didn't have as many domesticated food animals, they were developing more crops. I mean, obviously that's a guess. I don't know.
Yeah, now, of course, you could have had in Mesoamerica and in South America, you could have continued with the sort of relatively thin populations. There's no law of nature that I know of that says you had to develop complex urban civilizations such as they did develop. And as I think I asked about last week, well, you'd think this would have happened in the Mississippi Valley rather than in Mesoamerica, rather than in Central America. But yeah, once you find a crop or two, for reasons shrouded in the mist of history, once you find a crop or two that can sustain by systematic cultivation, by intensive agriculture, a large population, then you have what you need for a essentially urban society. With large-scale cultivation, you need large fields, you need a good deal more discipline, less casual gardening, and you have the makings of first town and then urban civilizations. And again, the fact that they didn't have the cattle, they didn't have the pigs, they didn't have the sheep that Eurasians and Africans had, big disadvantage to the people of the Western Hemisphere. And I think it's marvelous, really, that the advanced civilizations that developed in Mesoamerica and the Andes did indeed develop there. Okay, anything else? Okay, let's move to the specifics of the Pueblo people of what's now the southwest of the United States. And from here on, we are going to be taking a fairly close look. I emphasize fairly, none of these are going to be intensive tribal studies, but a fairly close look at a number of different native people and a fairly close look at the Spanish, well, less so on the Spanish, because we talked about them connection with Mesoamerica, but with the British and the French, and what impelled them to come to the Western Hemisphere, how they behaved when they got here. So our first native group is going to be the Pueblo people of what's now the United States Southwest, New Mexico and part of Arizona, northeastern Arizona. They were going strong when the Spanish put in an appearance, and they're going strong still. And the Pueblo people is, the Pueblo is a term, a collective term for three distinct but similar groups. Show up on the map here, the Hopi in northeastern Arizona, the smaller grouping of the Zuni here in western New Mexico, and then strung along the Rio Grande and its tributaries, the Rio Grande Pueblos in central New Mexico. At the time of the arrival of the Spanish, they all lived in apartment house towns. Couldn't really call them cities in the Mesoamerican sense, but certainly large towns with apartment houses, 50 to 500 buildings per town. Populations usually in the upper hundreds, with the largest population of a town, about 5,000 people, here at Acoma Pueblo, here in New Mexico. They were culturally similar people, but all spoke different languages, 3 different language families even. So while culturally they were very different, we'll be looking at a language map of North America shortly. While they were culturally very similar, their culture had clearly sprung from Mesoamerica, very different people linguistically. Okay, we're going to be looking most particularly at Acoma, Sky City. And that is down here, the most distant and isolated of the Rio Grande Pueblo people. And you can see why they call it Sky City. Here is the town itself on top of a mesa from a road approaching it. And here's Sky City itself from atop the mesa. We're not talking skyscrapers, obviously, but we're talking 2 or 3 story structures which existed when the Spanish arrived. Well, Sky City is one of the 4 Acoma towns, one of the 4 Acoma Pueblos. And if you're passing through about 80 miles west of Albuquerque, it's worth a visit. If you want a defensible town site, Sky City is it. But dry, common problem among the Pueblo people. Acoma, Sky City, and the other Acoma Pueblos strung out here, fair ways away from the water sources. The Pueblos closer to the Rio Grande River had the rivers and a bit more grass and a bit more rain, somewhat more smiling environment. The Hopi country out here, away from the rivers, really arid, really dry. Okay, where did they come from? Around, to take a year in time, about 300 BCE, there were three people in the American, what's now the ancient Southwest, what's now the American Southwest. People we call the ancestral Puebloans, the ancestors of the Pueblo people. And if you ever have a chance to get to Mesa Verde National Park, here in the Four Corners area, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, certainly well worth a visit. The ancestral Puebloans used agriculture as opposed to horticulture, some intensive, if relatively small scale farming with irrigation. Corn had arrived from its point of origin in Mesoamerica, central Mexico, about 2000 BCE, along with beans and squash. You'll recall last week I mentioned corn, beans, and squash, the sacred trinity of Western Hemisphere agriculture. And it's likely, almost certain, that the use of the idea of intensive agriculture arrived from Western Hemisphere, from Mesoamerica about that time. And you had to use every natural feature, every drop of water, every drop of rain to master the agricultural requirements of the area. The ancestral Puebloans moved on about 1250 in the Common Era, about the year 1250. Used to be thought a great mystery why and where they went, and there's still a lot of uncertainties. But it now looks as though there was an ecological crisis. Overpopulation, a few too many people, overuse of soil, perhaps a drought, several droughts, overuse of soil, as we never seem to learn, can lead to erosion. Okay, what reason do the Pueblo people give for their ancestors departing? Well, a rain and fertility deity, the serpent god, took off one night without warning. They'd done something wrong, and the spirit, the deity that they needed to maintain life as they knew it, life as they lived it, had left. And I think this is an important element, an important bit of what we call collective memory. Collective memory. You have to come up with a reason for something that ties in with what you think you know about yourself and what you think you know about your universe. If something happens, you need to come up with a rational explanation for it. Okay, between 1250 and 1400, various groups wandered about the Southwest. And finally, by about 1400, not that long before the arrival of the Spanish, the Hopi, Zuni, Rio Grande, Pueblo pattern of larger permanent towns developed that the Spanish encountered. Okay, what kind of people? It's worth remembering that when a Pueblo person died, he or she became a cloud. Clouds, of course, bring rain. And this fact tells us something about the importance of rainfall to an area dependent on dry farming. You're talking about an area using intensive agriculture necessary to wring enough to eat from land with 10 inches or less of rain annually. Okay, one of the results of this was that I think the people were deeply conservative, confronted constantly with the specter of starvation. And I think these conservative attitudes determined Pueblo culture, especially those like the Hopi, dependent on springs and rain, rather than the Rio Grande people along here who had the river that didn't go away completely. However, overall, you had what we could call a psychology of scarcity and caution that whites had trouble understanding. They carefully developed and carefully nurtured an irrigation system for intensive agriculture. And if you look back in one of last week's handouts, the population density map, you'll see that this area in what's now the American Southwest had the only really dense populations in the area of what's now the United States and Canada. They had also developed a formal priesthood. And it's worth pausing here and noting the distinction between a shaman and a priest. You've heard the term shaman, sometimes called a medicine man, medicine person, and a priest, but there is an important distinction, just as there's an important distinction between a warrior and a soldier, which we get into. Shaman, basically I think a part-time person, relatively informal. A priest, a full-time job requiring a certain amount of training and a tremendous amount of seriousness about the importance of your role. And this is not important. This is not surprising. It was terribly important to be able to remain in constant harmony with the spiritual, the natural forces on which you were completely dependent for your sustenance. And I know Gil Nichols in his classes and discussions has emphasized the importance of the link between the spiritual and the natural, and the idea that there is no real distinction. And again, important to remain in constant harmony on the spiritual and the natural forces on which you were completely dependent for your sustenance. And it's been estimated that Pueblo men spent up to half of their time in meticulously performed religious observances. These were important for their very survival. The sun god was the creating father, the earth god, the mother. And it's important to keep in mind that there was a degree of relative equality between the genders that the several flavors of Christianity that the Europeans brought certainly didn't match. The Kachina cult, and this is a Kachina doll, a Kachina deity that we see here. This had drifted up, we believe, from south in Mexico. These are, not surprisingly, rain deities. rain deities. These are masked spirits representing your dead ancestors, bringing rain. If you don't respect the Kachina, you don't get rain. If you don't get rain, you starve. You've laid up at least a 4 or 5 year stock of grain from good years to tide you over bad years. But over the long run, if you don't get enough rain, you starve or move. And again, as I mentioned a little earlier, what happens to a Puebloan when they die? They become clouds, manifested on earth as Kachinas. So the importance of rain, overwhelming. And again, the interdependency of humans and spirits. There was no real distinction between us and the spiritual world, and for that matter, the animal world. Each needs the other to survive. You give gifts, ceremonial gifts to the spirits, they give you a gift, rain and life. So the Kachina and the humans each feed the other. And feeding, eating, not surprisingly, is a big deal. If you feed something and someone, you transform him or her into kin. Many of the Pueblo people had a snake dance where they would be lashed until the blood flows. The blood would be used to feed the spirits. The whole religious outlook was guided by what we might call rites of transition and incorporation, rites of travel and incorporation. When you were not just raising corn, but hunting deer, and yes, involved in warfare, there was inter-Pueblo warfare. In warfare, even your enemy's body and scalp, if you removed a scalp, was respected and given gifts. When you hunt, you don't just chase the deer and stab it. You don't just use a spear, you suffocate the deer and you adopt them. Much easier to use a bow and arrow or a spear, but the way you kill the deer is terribly important. Children owe their parents respect and labor, and this is how society worked. Okay, it's, I think, worth looking, worth pausing to look at this horticulture and agricultural sexual divisions of labor in North America, Central and North America. Men only, principally. Down here where you had very large scale intensive agriculture, large fields, much larger areas down here in Mesoamerica and extending up quite a ways in Western Mexico. Bits and pieces up here in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin. But in the Pueblo country, in the Pueblo area, several other areas where there were townies, both sexes about equally responsible for agriculture. Both men and women worked in the fields. And then women only throughout most of the eastern United States, what's now the eastern United States and southeastern Canada, where horticulture, not intensive agriculture, was the means of growing food. And up here in what's now the Western United States, Baja California, most of Canada and Alaska, hunting and gathering rather than agriculture or horticulture. So the idea of sexual equality, gender equality of labor, primarily down here in Pueblo country and a few associated areas. And the female and the male in this world combined, one analogy would be that as corn seeds and rain combined. The Pueblo world needed both agriculture and warfare and hunting. Hunting, significant, deer hunting, but it was agriculture that was the basis. A structure called the kiva, K-I-V-A, was the ceremonial center of the Pueblo, usually an underground or semi-underground structure where the priests could ceremonially reenact in important ceremonies the emergence of humans from the underworld from which humans had sprung. The men's power tended to be stronger with the gods, with hunting, and with inter-Pueblo warfare. The women's power with the fields, matrilineal connections. House building, the women worked on building houses, making pottery, food preparation and distribution. And one more interesting point, in common with a number of other Native American people, there was a third gender category, often called two-spirit. Two-spirits. We'd call gay or transsexual people, symbolizing the joining of the sexes. So in many Native American groupings, tribes, and pueblos, you had a respected category for homosexual, gay, transsexual people. As long as they could make a significant contribution to the welfare of the Pueblo, the welfare of the tribe, they were welcome. There were specialized leaders in the Pueblo world, as you normally would have in a well-organized town environment. You had an inside chief, a high priest, a descendant of the sun, an outside chief who led in war. There were wars between towns over women, land, water, salt, turquoise, hunting grounds, and there were special purpose chiefs, all with religious functions, rain chiefs, hunt chiefs. So you turn to the person who had the specialization, who had the specialty that you needed. Okay, before we get on to where anthropologists, students, our ideas of what the Pueblo and other Native American worlds were like, that is, before we get to talking about oral tradition, let's open it up for a few questions. So if you have some comments or questions, unmute yourselves and let's chat for a few minutes.
Alan?
Yeah.
I had a couple of additions. I'll try to be brief, if you don't mind.
Oh, Gil, come on now. You and I know each other well enough.
Yeah.
to know.
A comment. Yeah, comment on the two-spirit phenomenon. Up at the Lakota, the two spirits are called Winkte.
Mhm.
And in the old days, they were highly valued as confidants. So if you're struggling with a tough problem, you're having trouble figuring it out, you would most likely go to a two-spirit because they saw things differently. And they could add a way of seeing that probably you weren't seeing. So they were highly respected back in the old days.
They could give a perspective that others couldn't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The other one is the migration ideas down among the Pueblos. And the Hopi, for example, was met by the deity of the surface of the earth, Masao, and told to migrate and to plant in various places. They were to locate certain very sacred areas of power that they could recognize. And those migrations, each clan, it took thousands of years of migrations. And then they finally, the first clans were approaching Third Mesa, and Masao told them this is where you're to settle. And years ago, about 20 years ago, I was a resource person for a tour group out of New Orleans. And we went to the Hopi Mesas and met an elder, Hopi elder there, who took us about 5 miles west of Third Mesa. And we turned off the road and went off into the north off the road, went deep into a canyon. And the canyon walls were full of petroglyphs.
Mm.
And it's interesting, I mean, just literally, it's interesting that every place else you see petroglyphs, you'll see spirals. And those spirals are, and you'll see a clan figure by the spiral, which tells you where the clan was when they were in the migration that they were instructed to do throughout the centuries. But there were no spirals in that canyon wall. There were what we would call, using the Sanskrit word of swastika. It's a Sanskrit word.
Yep.
There were swastikas in there with a clan symbol. And what those swastikas meant is that the migrations for that clan were done, that they had followed all the instructions that were needed, and that they had settled there on those 3 mesas. So I found just really exciting just to be there to hear this elder talk about the migrations and why there are no spirals in that canyon, because the canyon represented the end of thousands of years of migrations.
Yeah. Yeah, Gil, thanks much for that fine elaboration.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of things. None of these local glances, as it were, the Pueblo, then we'll be looking at the Powhatan in Virginia, Eastern Virginia. None of these are detailed studies. They're quick surveys. And also, many of the generalizations that I'm going to be that I've talked about, say with the Pueblo, some of them applied with significant modifications with other people in North America, and some did not. So a tremendous variety of people, a tremendous variety of attitudes among Native Americans, along with some commonalities that we'll be talking about. Okay, anything else?
Alan,
Alan?
this is, oh, go ahead.
I know that, and maybe this is what Gil was referring to. The Hopi talk about an origin point where they emerged into this world from a world beneath them. Maybe that's a migration thing. I don't know. But Sipapu, is that what they called it? Sipapu? The emergent spot that's in a canyon tributary to the Grand Canyon. Gil, did they talk at all about that?
Yes, yeah, the emergence out of the third world.
Yeah, yeah.
And some of them stayed in the third, and the sacred clowns were the ones that guided them into the fourth world. And they would emerge first and check and make sure everything was okay to proceed into this world.
And then the Dene, the Navajo, had sort of also had a layer of worlds. Is that right too? Even though they're different than the Pueblos, but isn't there?
Yes, right.
So, anyway,
Mm-hmm.
wondered about that.
Okay,
every
anyone
key-
else? Oh, sorry.
Alan, this is Lori. Carolyn Daly has a question in the chat box. How are anthropologists able to know about the third category of genders? She's wondering if perhaps it was something from their writing system.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes. How are anthropologists able to know about the third category of genders?
They're still around. And I'll be getting in a few minutes into oral tradition. So, one way is oral tradition, but for the two peoples, the two genders, multiple people, gay people, they're still there. When the first Europeans arrived, they found that there were a number of characteristics of Plains Indian people and people and tribal people throughout that were very, very different from what they were accustomed to. And that was one of them. It was still there when the first Europeans arrived, and it's still there. Before it became acceptable to be gay in, say, the United States, in very recent memory, it was acceptable to be gay from time immemorial among tribal people. Not everywhere, but many of them.
Thank you, Alan. I'm going to put myself on mute.
Okay, and anything else? Okay, well, let's pick up then with how it is we know something about the people that we're looking at. And the term here is oral tradition. Gil had actually mentioned an additional, relatively minor, but still very significant source of information, petroglyphs, carvings on rock, messages left on rocks. None of the cultures we're looking at developed a proper written language. That happened among the Maya and Mesoamerica primarily, but you did have petroglyphs, drawings, sometimes very artistically done on rocks, that could, when interpreted by local people, tell you a good deal about where you felt you came from. But primarily it's oral tradition. It's what anthropologists, and before them priests, ministers, were told by the local people. And oral tradition, of course, is not just a indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere characteristic. Each people, each tribe, everywhere in the world has told each other stories about where they came from and about their great deeds. And the stories were carried on by the people who conquered or otherwise blended with them or replaced them. The Pueblo people inherited and doubtless modified traditions of the ancestral Pueblo people. Now, we usually call these stories myths and legends. And eventually these myths and legends were told to the Spaniards, usually the priests, because they were the only ones who cared, and written down by the priests. A lot of what we know or think we know about these early civilizations stems from these tales, just as a lot of what we know about the ancient Greeks stems from Homer. Now, until a century and a half ago, no right-thinking European or American took the oral tradition of myths and legends very seriously. But then, amazingly, in 1871, Troy was found just about where Homer had said it was. There's some question as to that now, but nevertheless, in 1871, they found what they were certain was the ruins of Troy. Archaeologists found Troy, and it was just about, reading Homer, where he had said it was. And soon other discoveries at the hands of the still very new science of archaeology, discoveries in Greece, Crete, the Near and Middle East of relics and sites of early civilizations, often tallying with Greek stories, or in the Middle East, Near East, sometimes tallying with biblical stories. All of a sudden, it became accepting the substantive truth of much legendary information positively trendy. And since the Second World War, there's been a dramatic increase in scholarly respect for pre-literate Amerindian, American Indian, and other native cultures. Has made it mandatory, almost mandatory, to believe that tribal traditions are reliable guides to what was going on before anyone got around to writing things down. Well, sometimes. The oral tradition of myths and legends was never intended in any culture to be a dry narration of historic events. You have to look to modern historians for dry narrations. So what is the oral tradition? What are myths? Well, and I should have put this down in the handout, a quotation from a scholar, but myths express the values and ideals that organize and make people's lives meaningful. And I'll repeat that. Myths express the values and ideas that organize and make people's lives meaningful. And that's from a historian, a scholar, Ramon Gutierrez. Myths express the values and ideals that organize and make people's lives meaningful. That is, its purpose was to illustrate, and is to illustrate, the tribe's ideas of its own origins and the origins of its culture. The important thing was the strengthening of tribal, or today national, unity, of the inherent pattern of religious belief, or of the nasty, evil impression of one's traditional enemy. In short, this is the same sort of thing that in modern America produced the Betsy Ross legend, which has no substance to it, George Washington and the cherry tree, which really has no substance to it. Lots of other American and other national origin myths. Non-literate people may depend on oral traditions rather than on written accounts, but they're not the only ones to use history to reinforce what they want to believe about themselves. Now, this is not an attempt to poobah, to use a technical term, all or even most oral tradition as a narration of facts. Often it is fairly reliable, as with Homer and the approximate location of Troy. And often it is most of what we have to go on when dealing with the non-literate people. But always keep in mind the primary purpose of legend, to reinforce what you already know about yourself. There's a tribe of Native American people, the Blackfoot. Probably heard of the Blackfoot tribe, Plains people. They became very good horsemen. The horse became very important to Blackfoot culture. Where did the horse come from? The horse was a gift from the sky and water spirits. A gift to the Blackfoot people from the sky and water spirits. But we know that the Blackfoot got horses in the 17th century at the earliest, because there were no horses in North America or South America until the Spanish brought them. Another example, in 1539 to 1542, Spanish conquistador and explorer Hernando de Soto marched through what's now the southeastern United States. 1539 to 1542. Person from another world, people from another world marching through the southeastern United States, what became the southeastern United States. You'd think this would have been remembered by the local people. It wasn't. There was no oral tradition of De Soto's arrival in March. Once British, French, Americans talked to them about it. Why? Because he was of no consequence, as far as they could see. He didn't, luckily, bring a disease. He marched through. Was annoying for a bit. He was smart enough not to try to wail the bejesus out of people. He knew there were a small number of his people, but he wasn't remembered. Okay, you're going to say that written accounts are not always terribly reliable either. And that's true. Oral and written accounts are usually designed to serve purposes other than to record objective fact. For that matter, try to find two people who can agree on just what the objective, relevant facts were. Many of us may have seen Rashomon, the 1950 Japanese film, Rashomon. R-I-S-A, well, this is on your word list. Rashomon should be on your word list. Let me see. Maybe not. R-I-S-H-O-M-O-N, Rashomon, 1950 Japanese film. 4 people witness a murder, same murder. They give 4 different versions, depending on their circumstance. And they weren't lying, they weren't making anything up. They just saw the circumstances of the murder very differently. Okay, the one big advantage of written records, though, you can usually find multiple versions of the same story. And hopefully, by comparing these multiple versions, you can arrive at an interpretation that you, as a historian or an anthropologist or whatever, think to be the most reasonable. And if you're lucky, you can find an old version telling you exactly what was being said orally on the topic 100 or 1,000 years ago. So you may be able to trace the evolution of the story through different generations. That's the big advantage of writing, of the written tradition, as it were. With the oral tradition, you have no way of knowing what was being said a century ago. Okay, after that discussion on oral and written tradition, we're also getting fairly late in the class. Let's open it up for comments again, for comments and discussion. Any comments? Any questions? Don't forget to unmute yourself. Okay, well, let's what, you believe me? Okay. Okay, let's carry on with the next slide and with getting into the next segment of the course. Here's the promised North American language map. And let's bring this up. Okay, we're going to be talking very briefly about a few of the other people that turned up in the southwestern United States, what's now the southwestern United States, and that the Pueblo had to contend with. Remember, the Pueblo people were sedentary agriculturalists. They wore and wove cotton cloth. They were stay-at-homes most of the time. They didn't range very far from their towns, although there was considerable Pueblo-to-Pueblo warfare. But the other people in the neighborhood weren't of this sort. And just to get an idea of the complexity of the makeup of North America, if you're not already convinced of that, here's a rough map of the North American language families. And specifically, I'm bringing this up because we're going to be talking about, beginning in the class next week, with the ancestors of the Navajo and the Apache, who came into the Pueblo area centuries after the Pueblo people had come in themselves. And they are Athabascan speakers. You'll see the Athabascan group came down from northwestern, what's now northwestern Canada. And Gil, in one of his comments earlier, had mentioned the long period of time it takes for many migrations to take place. But eventually the ancestors of the Navajo and the Apache, other denizens of what's now the American Southwest, came down, leaving most Athabascan speakers up here, but the ancestors of the Navajo and Apache down here. And here again, a more detailed map of the Athabascan language distribution. Most of them up here in northwestern Canada, north central Canada and Alaska, but chunks of them down here. little small bits and pieces along the coast of northern California and southern Oregon. But it's worth just, well, ending this particular class with the realization of the complexity of the tribal makeup and the linguistic makeup. Athabascans up here, a bunch of Athabascans down here, Caddoan speakers and one big group down here, a smaller group up here, a much smaller group here, Iroquoian speakers up here, the Siouan language speakers up in here in the American Midwest, the Eskimo and Inuit people. We'll get to them towards the end of the course, up here in the far northwest, far north of Canada. So incredibly complex linguistic groups. And if you ever had any question that there had been separate migrations coming over from Siberia, different people with geographic and somewhat culturally different origins, I think the complexity of the language map should put paid to that idea. Okay, we're about ready to finish up, but let's open it up for a last group of questions. If you have something to say or something to ask, please unmute yourself and speak up.
I have a question. You mentioned that there were 3 language groups in the Pueblo people, but you didn't
Yes, good. I'm glad.
elaborate.
Yeah. Yes, I mentioned in my introduction on this map that this is a rough linguistic map of North America and Mesoamerica, but there's a lot of little local detail that the map simply can't show. And yeah,
So what were the 3?
Oh gosh, I would have to go
Okay,
back.
that's all right.
Caddoan,
Kiwa.
yeah, I'd have to look that up. You'll have to take my word for it that they were
Okay, that's fine.
different groups. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question. The Athapascan, I see where they kind of, their migration pattern. And of course, we're so familiar with them west of us. But I'm rather amazed by all the other languages and people. So did they come from the southwest part of the world? Like, everybody settled Midwest, Far East. Where did those language speaking people migrate from?
Okay, so far as we now know, all of the ancestors of the people from people in the Western Hemisphere came from what's now northwestern Siberia and northern China.
Okay.
But of course, they didn't originate there. People have been moving about and migrating and picking up new customs, new habits, new enemies, new allies, ever since we began moving out of Africa, ever since Homo sapiens began moving out of Africa, tens of thousands and more years ago. But yeah, before you came across the Bering Land Bridge or down the Pacific coast of North America from Beringia, all of the evidence indicates that you came from what's now Siberia, northwestern China, Manchuria. But before then, the human race has never been stable. the human race has never settled permanently in one place. And fortunately, there has been a certain amount of cooperation between American, European, Chinese, first Soviet, and then Russian and Japanese ethnographers, historical ethnographers, looking into just this question. So there'll be lots more to learn, but yeah, different blood types, different languages, different language groups. And of course, languages evolve. Native Americans have been in the Western Hemisphere for, at the very least, 12,000 years, probably at least 15,000 years. That gives languages a good deal of time to evolve and change. But there were still different groups of people. Okay, that's a long-winded answer to your question. Does that help?
Alan, this is Louise speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Gil mentioned the swastika that he was touring with people
Oh, yeah.
inside that cavern. That is tied in with the ancient Chinese symbol. They use that a lot in everything they made. So do you agree that that was brought over, you know, across the Bering Sea from people from Asia?
Yeah, well, you know, the swastika, the first Europeans heard about it. It came out of India. But there's a lot of things that have been independently developed in the Western Hemisphere and in other parts of the world. For example, people who argued strongly that Western Hemisphere indigenous people got all of their ideas from Europe or the Mideast or from Africa or wherever would say, well, look, the Egyptians developed pyramids. That's where the Mesoamerican people came up with the idea of pyramids. Well, no, the pyramid is a basic structure. You start piling soil up, you want to get a height to show how important you are, and a pyramid is a logical sort of a structure. And drawings that you came up with for decoration or increasingly for communication on things like petroglyphs, crossing two lines, very logical. Then put little feet on crossing those two cross lines, the ends of the two cross lines, and hey, you've got a swastika. So, Gil, do you have any thought on that, on the origins, independent origins in the Western Hemisphere of the swastika?
No, the only thing I know about it is that for the Hopis, that represented that clan's end of migration, and because it goes in four directions,
Yeah.
The spirit of the surface of the earth had instructed them to go each of the four directions. And when you have the cross symbol representing the four directions, and then the line coming horizontally off of that or vertically, whichever, meant that they had turned around and retraced back to the center again. And so that was the symbolism. I don't think it had anything to do with the Sanskrit symbol that you find often in Hinduism, which really, when I was in India, the Sanskrit represented the Dharma, the things that were that swastika symbol, the things that were good that would come to you, you know, when you lived in that kind of a life. And so it was a completely different interpretation, even though the symbols were very similar, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, again, I'd argue that there are some designs, some ideas that, you know, occur to a number of different people at a number of different times and places, and are put to a number of different uses.
Thank you.
I looked that up because I was interested in the fact that I had seen that symbol inside of Santa Fe railroad cars when I was little, and said the Navajos called them whirling logs, and it's counterclockwise, whereas the swastika is clockwise. And there's a really pervasive use of that symbol throughout all cultures and religions. A lot of them, I shouldn't say all of them, but the Hopis used it for wandering, and the Navajos used it in healing rituals. And I would kind of think of that as being traveling in an altered state.
Yeah, the Nazis have a tremendous amount to answer for, and one of the lesser things would be that by adopting the swastika as a symbol of the Nazi party, they've made it difficult to look at it objectively and unemotionally. Yeah, I think it served a lot of different purposes in a lot of different times and places. Okay, well, folks, thank you. I think we've had some really good discussions, and I'm looking forward to some more next week. Next week we'll get into briefly the Navajo and Apache. We won't talk about them culturally, but simply the fact that they were a major annoyance to the Pueblo people. And then we'll get to the Spanish invasion and take it from there. So see you next week.
Bye, Alan.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Alan.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Okay, thank you.